Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise, get straight to the interesting stuff. And today, we're diving into something pretty significant. A recent development. A former U.S. president. A bold threat towards Russia. And this strange 50-day ultimatum. This isn't just a quick headline. The material we've looked at suggests it could have really big implications.
Yeah.
Global power, Ukraine, Europe's future. It's all in the mix. Our source for this deep dive is pretty interesting. It's a transcript from a YouTube video featuring insights from someone with quite a background, a former U.S. Marine intelligence officer, also a UN weapons inspector.
Right. And our mission, really, is to unpack what the source says about this. Let's call it audacious plan. We're looking at the two main parts, these weapon shipments that were promised, and then these sweeping secondary sanctions. And crucially, why this expert in the source material flat out calls it guaranteed of failure. We'll also try to peel back the layers based on the source to see what might be the real purpose behind this 50-day thing. Plus, some pretty dramatic predictions for Europe. It's all laid out in this source we're examining.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack it. This 50-day ultimatum, it does seem like a real shift, doesn't it? I mean, for a while, the narrative was more about a peace mandate, right? But now this source highlights a plan that includes keeping the weapons flowing and threatening these huge secondary sanctions, 100%, it says, against anyone trading with Russia.
Exactly. And what jumps out immediately from this expert's assessment in the source is just how blunt it is. The quote is, "There's never been a plan more guaranteed of failure than this plan." Pretty stark. The source claims it has no legs, no chance. It's just not sustainable. Basically, doomed to fail right from the get-go.
Wow, that's quite the opening assessment. Okay, let's dig into the military part first. The former president mentioned delivering 17 Patriot batteries. Now, based on the source, what's the actual reality check on these weapon deliveries?
Well, the expert cited is extremely skeptical, highly doubtful about those numbers. They say it directly in the source material, something like, I don't think there's 17 batteries, I don't think there's 5 batteries. I'd be surprised if you can find 2 batteries to be shipped right now.
Only 2, really?
That's the claim. And the context given is key. You've got the Dutch, apparently, talking about sending something, maybe, and the Germans are promising something down the road. But, and this is the kicker, according to the source, these are apparently dependent on getting replacements, a backfill from Swiss Patriot orders. Okay. And those Swiss orders, the source says they aren't even scheduled for delivery until 2026, maybe 2027.
So wait, if we're in July 2025 now.
Exactly. It implies the Ukrainians wouldn't see these particular batteries until 2026 at the earliest. There's a huge gap there between the talk and the logistics. And then you contrast that, as the expert does, with the situation right now. Just last night, the source says, the Russians fired 450 drones into Ukraine.
450 in one night.
Yeah. And on top of that, the source cites Italian newspapers saying Russia is ramping up production, maybe towards 1,000 drones a day.
1,000 a day.
So you put those numbers, the sheer volume of incoming threats, next to these maybe possibly deliveries in a year or two Patriot batteries, and the expert's conclusion is pretty blunt. The policy just makes no sense. It's doomed to fail. The scale just doesn't match up at all, according to this analysis.
Right, so the military piece seems aspirational at best, based on this source. What about the other side, the economic pressure? The plan involves these secondary sanctions. For listeners, that means targeting not just Russia, but other countries, other companies that keep doing business with Russia. So how did Russia react to this threat? And maybe more importantly, what about big players like China, India, Brazil? What does the source say about their response?
Well, according to the expert in the source, Russia's reaction was basically indifference. Russia could care less is the phrase used. Actually, it gets more interesting. When the plan was announced, the Russian stock market apparently went up. Increased value 2.7%.
Went up.
Yeah. The experts' take in the source is that the Russians thrive under sanctions. So 0 immediate negative impact, maybe even a boost from this perspective.
If they partners? China.
China's stance, as described in the source, is very firm. They're seen as already committed to doubling down on Russia. The expert suggests China views the Ukraine conflict as linked to their own interests, drawing parallels with Taiwan. It's seen as a Chinese conflict, too, in a way.
Interesting framing.
And the source recalls a pretty strong reaction from China earlier when Europe put just 3 Chinese companies on their 18th sanctions list. China's message, as relayed by the expert, was apparently really forceful. Something like, if you really want to commit suicide, go ahead, but we will punch back and we pump out hard. We will knock your ass out.
Wow, okay, direct.
Very. And the source also mentions an incident back in April. The U.S. apparently put some sanctions on China, and China hit back hard by cutting off all deliveries of rare earth minerals and magnetic materials to the United States.
Ouch. That stuff is critical, right, for manufacturing.
Absolutely. Things like EV motors, high-tech electronics. The source claims this move basically destroyed the American automobile manufacturing base temporarily, a situation that was apparently only recently rectified in June. So, the expert's point is China holds serious leverage. They argue China doesn't need us and could just pull the plug.
Okay, so China's pushing back hard. What about Brazil and India?
Brazil, according to the source, has been pretty clear. If you don't want to trade with us, we don't want to trade with you. Simple as that. And India. Well, the expert thinks it's highly unlikely India would sacrifice its sovereignty for the insane unpredictability of this administration, especially given India's deep involvement in groups like BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the G20. They have other priorities, other relationships.
They're playing a different game.
Exactly. So the overall prediction from the expert in the source, I personally don't believe these sanctions will ever be implemented. They're seen as just a gimmick.
Okay. This analysis is painting a picture where the military promises are shaky, the sanctions are, well, likely ineffective. So this is where the source offers a really surprising twist, isn't it? If the weapons aren't really coming in force and the sanctions won't bite, what could be the real reason, the deeper purpose behind this 50-day pause? What's the hypothesis here?
Yeah, this is where the source gets particularly provocative. It cites Seymour Hersh, the investigative journalist, specifically his recent Substack article. And the suggestion put forward by the expert, based on Hersh, is that the Trump administration is, quote, actively moving to get Vladimir Zelensky removed from office.
Removed from office. Regime change.
That's a claim from the source. It's argued that this is the only thing a 50-day pause makes sense of, the alleged objective, regime change in Ukraine. To replace Zelensky, presumably with a government that's more sympathetic to the Russian demands, and that could then pave the way for a ceasefire.
And does the source mention who might replace him?
It touches on Zelensky, the former commander-in-chief, but casts doubt on his suitability. The source mentions a controversial image described as Zelensky in a selfie with a photograph of Stepan Bandera in the background. Posing next to someone the source labels with a term often used to allege far-right ties, Bandera himself is a deeply divisive historical figure.
Okay. And the Russian perspective on this,
Yeah.
according to the source.
From the Russian viewpoint, as conveyed by the expert, Zelensky is seen as not that legitimate authority.
Right.
So his removal is considered sort of a prerequisite for creating a government that could legally accepting the terms of surrender dictated by Russia. The analysis here is stark. Ukraine has lost this war, will get nothing, and Russia will make no concessions.
And what about the Ukrainian elite? Why would they want Zelensky out? According to this source's theory, it's not about peace.
Apparently not, according to this expert. The claim is it's because Zelensky is costing them access to Western money, that he can no longer effectively rattle the tin can, bring in the funds that they allegedly use for self-enrichment. So Russia, in this view, sees the Ukrainian ruling elite as the root cause of the conflict and believes they will not be allowed to stay after the war. The source states the Russians are already preparing for post-conflict reality. They have a government ready to move in, and it will be Russia dictating what the future of Ukraine will look like.
This perspective really flips the script on the usual narrative about how the conflict started and who the main drivers are. The source seems to point the finger elsewhere. What's the argument about the U.S. role in all this?
Yes, it's a very different take. The expert in the source asserts quite directly the United States started this war, not Russia. That's the claim.
Started the war. How?
They point back to the first Trump term, arguing it created the necessary conditions. Specifically, training Ukrainian soldiers in Western Ukraine starting way back in 2015. The source claims that by 2016-17, around 500 Ukrainians were being trained every 55 days. And the alleged purpose: to send them east to kill Russians in the Donbass.
That's a strong accusation.
It is. The source uses the term geopolitical arsonist to describe the U.S. And in this analogy, the Russians are positioned as the firefighters, who will eventually put the fire out, but on their own terms. There's also sharp criticism aimed at the understanding, or alleged lack thereof, among U.S. leadership regarding Ukraine. The source specifically names advisors like Keith Kellogg, Senator Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, suggesting they lack a deep grasp of the history, the complexities of the Ukrainian question, as the source puts it.
Okay, so if that's the context presented by the source,
Yeah.
this brings us back to Europe. What does all this mean for them? The Trump plan apparently involves Europeans buying more U.S. weapons, but the source questions if Europe is even in a position to do that, let alone fight effectively.
Right. The expert notes Europe is somewhat divided on this. You have Italy and France, apparently not very keen on more military spending. Then you have Germany and the UK, described as still gung-ho on war. But there's a big but. Take Germany. The expert claims they can't deploy 4,000 troops to Lithuania. They just don't have the resources for major military action. The source makes a really stark claim. Germany is bankrupt. A collapsing economy. It even cites anecdotes like Audi apparently destroying unsold cars because there are no buyers.
Destroying cars. Wow. Bankrupt is a strong word.
Very strong. And the implication is to even try to fund military spending, Europe is supposedly cutting social programs, things people rely on, the 4-day work week, paid holidays, healthcare, education. It's all potentially on the chopping block. The expert argues this is leading Europe towards collapsing into third world status.
That's a dramatic prediction.
It is, and the criticism extends to European leaders. Figures like Merz in Germany, Starmer in the UK, described as grossly irresponsible. Merz is even quoted, maybe somewhat hyperbolically, as seeming to want to invade Russia the right way this time, implying a desire to correct some historical mistake. The source is quite dismissive of the German army, the Bundeswehr, painting a picture of them being totally unprepared for serious conflict. The phrase used involves beer-drinking, schnitzel-eating fat men who'd be slaughtered. Very harsh language.
Extremely harsh.
And the prediction from Merz and Starmer, the expert believes neither will last the year.
Okay. And there were mentions of nuclear implications, too.
Yes, that's another layer. The argument presented is that Europe's economic collapse could force Britain and France to give up their independent nuclear deterrence, unilateral disarmament because they're simply unaffordable. The source adds a critical note, suggesting these nations can't be trusted with nuclear weapons anyway, especially after something called the North Declaration, which the expert interprets as talk about a shared nuclear umbrella while also discussing conventional intervention.
So the overall picture for Europe in this analysis is bleak.
Extremely bleak. The expert sums it up brutally. Europe doesn't matter. Europe doesn't count. Europe is nothing. One giant nothing burger. The prediction is it will rot, collapse, face massive political upheaval. And from the Russian perspective, according to the source, they just wanted stability, trading partners. But Europe keeps creating this specter of a Russian threat that doesn't exist.
There was also something about NATO and Kaliningrad.
Right. The source mentions a statement attributed to General Christopher Donahue about NATO potentially taking Kaliningrad. The warning from the expert is severe. Doing that would mean nuclear war, because Kaliningrad is considered a constitutional part of the Russian Federation. An attack there is seen as an existential threat. The consequence: NATO and Europe would disappear from the face of the earth. That's the source's stark warning.
And how does America fit into this view of Europe's future?
The source suggests America will eventually get fed up with Europe. Why? Because Europe brings not a damn thing to the alliance anymore, no functioning economy, no national pride. It even brings up a quote attributed to J.D. Vance telling Europeans, "We don't need vassals, we need allies."
A call for capable partners, not dependents.
Exactly. And this ties into the decline of military readiness. The source talks about Euro-rot, a loss of national identity. The argument is that modern European societies don't produce warriors anymore. People are physically unfit, lack motivation for conscription, making European militaries across the board universally not prepared to wage high-intensity conflict.
So putting it all together, the picture painted by this source is, well, it's stunning, really. A U.S. plan seemingly destined for failure, a hidden agenda potentially driving a political ultimatum, and a vision of Europe facing just profound decline, maybe even self-destruction.
It absolutely is. The central idea coming from this expert is that this conflict isn't just about Ukraine's borders anymore. It's fundamentally reshaping the entire global landscape, and especially Europe's place within it. The source predicts that future generations will look back at 2014 and the foolishness of continuing this even when the consequences became known.
Which really does raise a big question, doesn't it, for you listening right now? When you hear these kinds of detailed, often quite stark predictions, these geopolitical shifts, the economic warnings, these claims of history repeating itself, all coming from this particular analysis, what does it mean for your own understanding of global power? And the choices nations seem to be making, even when, according to this source, the potential negative consequences are laid bare but are still being pursued. How do we, just as individuals trying to make sense of it all, grapple with such complex unfolding realities, especially when faced with such a provocative perspective like the one we've explored today? Something to think about.